I'm grateful to the organizers for inviting me here. It is an honor to be speaking before such an august gathering as I see before myself. There was a song that I remember when I was studying in London. It was a song about some teacher, and one of the things they showed was a machine in which they are putting in meat and separate vegetables and separate fruits, and then it's all meshed up together and coming out of that machine as a mesh. Separation, when we talk about separation of powers in the Constitution, it's supposed to be a very straight line, a straight jacket line between the parliament, the judiciary and the executive. But unfortunately, in Pakistan, I would equate it that we have, in spite of having a proper constitution, meshed up our concept of separation of powers. And it is this messing up of this very important constitutional scheme of things that has created the mayhem that we face in history. The concept of separation of powers is very clear. There has to be a parliament which has to be sovereign. The parliament is supposed to make laws and ensure that those laws are properly implemented. It is supposed to fulfill the aspirations of the people. The judiciary, on the other hand, the judiciary has its own role, and Supreme Court of Pakistan and the superior courts of Pakistan were created for that purpose, to fulfill that role. I am reminded, and I think it is worth mentioning, that when the concept of separation of powers was being discussed by the forefathers of the US Constitution, there was a big argument amongst the parliamentarians. Should we give the power of judicial review to the US Supreme Court? Many parliamentarians said, no, we are elected people, we are elected with the votes of the people, we have to put in so much effort to sit in parliament. These people, these judges are only going to be selected and appointed. Why should they have a power of judicial review over the laws that we make? And this argument was going back and forth. And then eventually, one gentleman, a great jurist, he stood up, he said, look, the judiciary will neither have the power of the sword, nor will they have the purse. There will be no money with them. They will not have the power to implement their judgments. So why should we not give this institution the power of judicial review? It will be just a side institution, very subordinate to us. How wrong they were. How wrong they were. Because as the US history tells us of the Supreme Court of US, they in fact changed the course of history. When we in Pakistan were making the 1973 Constitution, our forefathers also were impressed by this concept. So they gave complete powers, in fact, more powers than any court in the world, to our superior courts. They had the power of judicial review. They could enforce fundamental rights. Supreme Court was given the power of Article 184(3). Under this power of 184(3), they could suo moto take action. They were given advisory jurisdiction. If there was a dispute between the province and the federation, they could decide that dispute. And above all and foremost, they had the power of interpreting the laws and the Constitution. So they had immense powers. And we hoped that with the parliament being there, parliament being sovereign to make laws, with the judiciary being there, given the power to enforce fundamental rights and even to implement the constitutional provisions, and the executive, we will have this complete separation of powers. But what happened? What went wrong? Why do I say that we have messed it up? The reason is reputation in the public. The loss of reputation in the public. The moment an institution loses its reputation in the public, it will give way to the other institution to encroach upon the powers of the other. Let us see Parliament. Parliament in Pakistan's history, with this intelligent audience that we have, let me say very briefly, Parliament's history has not been free of sins. Our first sin was that we got independence in 1947, and it took us 10 years to make the first constitution. The parliamentarians who sat in the constitution did not make the constitution because there was a conflict of interest. What was the conflict of interest? The conflict of interest was that as soon as they made the constitution, they would have had to go away. So it was in their interest to delay the making of the constitution. Finally, when they were dissolved and a new body came in, they gave us the 1956 constitution. But what happened then? History tells us that there was musical chairs. Every 15, 20 days, every 4 months, every 6 months, the Prime Minister would come and the Prime Minister would go. Why would the Prime Minister come and go? Because the members were defecting. The members of the political party were defecting. And the defection caused this musical chairs. The entire world made fun of us. And what happened? Ladies and gentlemen, what happened was martial law came in. Martial law came in, and thereafter the parliamentarians accepted that martial law, and for 10, 15 years we saw Ayub Khan's government. 1973 constitution came. Elections were held in 77. There was massive rigging. There were protests and riots. What happened? Ziaul Haq's martial law came in. The politicians, the parliamentarians distributed sweets. The PNA movement, the people, the 7 stars, 7 parties, top parties of the country, they joined the Majlis-e-Shura of Ziaul Haq till Bhutto was hanged, and then they were thrown away as tissue paper by the Ziaul Haq regime. Thereafter, what happened? Democracy came. Case of exploding bombs or exploding mangoes. Ziaul Haq died. Democracy was restored. But did we have a very satisfactory parliamentary history? No. You remember Changa Manga. You remember Mari. You all remember how people, MNAs, MPAs, senators, they were put in rest houses, how to vote, how not to vote. None of the 4 governments that came could complete their term. Every 2-3 years, we saw infighting, and ultimately, first Nawaz Sharif came, he went, Benazir Bhutto came, she went, Nawaz Sharif came back, he went, and so on and so forth. Until what happened? Musharraf stepped in, another martial law. So the reputation of the parliamentarians was destroyed. during all this time in history. When reputation of parliamentarians is destroyed, their concept of separation of power, their powers under the concept of separation of powers will be taken over by somebody else. In these instances, it was the military regime. Once Musharraf went, what happened? What happened was something very strange. Because when Musharraf went and Parliament came back, we thought now we will have this proper democracy. Because we've gone through thick and thin. Judiciary was removed by Musharraf and it was restored by the movement of black coats. So we were all very happy. We were very glad that now we will have this true independent judiciary. We will have a parliament that must have learned its lesson, and we will then have a proper functioning democracy. But something strange happened. And what was that strange thing that happened? The strange thing that happened was that, number one, the media became too independent and too powerful. When the media became too independent and powerful, they started taking up cases and insisting upon the courts to take suo motu jurisdiction. We saw as soon as the Chief Justice Iftikhar Chaudhry was restrained, we saw that headlines were relating to the observations made by the courts. And so, with the media rising and the popularity of the judges rising, they started encroaching upon what was traditionally the realm of the executive or the realm of the parliament, the legislature. This phenomena was not just restricted to Pakistan, by the way. I have studied this phenomena. This phenomena was worldwide. It was everywhere. Everywhere, this media was becoming free. There were TV channels everywhere. There were YouTube channels also cropping up. And that popularity factor stepped in. The popularity factor that only parliamentarians or politicians crave for, that concept also started stepping into the judiciary. And we saw, therefore, policy decisions being taken. We saw, therefore, certain executive decisions being taken. And we saw that the scope of interpretation was expanded so that sometimes even laws were amended. Now, this concept is prevailing today. But at the same time, the institution of the judiciary has become stronger. And we need to realize that it is the institution that matters at the end of the day. A few judgments that you can say have encroached upon the fields of others should not change the basic concept of separation of powers, the basic concept that institutions have to do their own bit. The institutions have to guard their own jurisdiction very strictly, but at the same time not encroach upon the other. Talking about the judiciary very briefly, the judiciary also has a history, but it is a misunderstood history, frankly. We have seen that starting from the Dosa judgment, in which the doctrine of necessity was accepted by the judiciary, going on to Nusrat Bhutto's case, in which again the doctrine of necessity was accepted when Ziaul Haq's martial law was accepted, and moving on to Zafar Ali Shah case, in which Musharraf's martial law was also accepted on the basis of doctrine of necessity. People have said that, look, the judiciary has succumbed, and had the judiciary stood up, then this would not have happened, what happened in our history. Let me correct you for a minute. It is not, yes, you can blame the judiciary to some extent, you can criticize these three judgments, but we cannot lay the entire blame on them. The judiciary is only 7 or 8 or 10 or 15 or 17 people. If the civil society, particularly the parliamentarians, the educated people, like lawyers community, if they don't stand up against martial law regimes or any deviation of constitution, then we cannot just lay the blame on the courts. The courts, in spite of all this historical things that happened, the courts have been working. They have been giving fundamental rights to the people of Pakistan. There are many, many cases in which rights of education, right to life, right to water, freedom, liberties, all these have been protected by our judiciary. Yes, coming back to my theme, we have committed one fault.